Have you ever played a video game that turned out to give you an experience you've never had before? What about a game that has elements that sound like they don't work together well, but still somehow do? Well, Shenmue is that very game. Shenmue is a lot of things. It's a fighting game, an RPG, a detective story, and a 1980s Japanese life simulator. That's a weird combination of game elements and settings that sound like it won't work very well, but somehow it just works. Shenmue first released back in December 29th, 1999 in Japan, November 8th, 2000 in North America, and finally December 1st, 2000 in European countries. Created from the mind of the famed Yu Suzuki and published by Sega, it was reportedly the most expensive game ever made for its time, supposedly over $70 million, though apparently some of that was put towards its sequel Shenmue 2, and Yu Suzuki even claimed the number to be closer to $47 million, with some of that going into the marketing. Even though Shenmue 1 and 2 were seen as phenomenal games of the time, they apparently weren't financially successful. Not only were they exclusive to the dying Dreamcast, but America didn't even get Shenmue 2 on that very console. It was an Xbox exclusive when it released over here. That's where things would end up getting a bit hairier since. Not only was the hope that Dreamcast players would follow the game to Xbox, but Xbox didn't even get a port of the first game. That was a weird divide to place on players, especially during the rocketing sales of the PS2 at the time. Imagine playing Shenmue 1 on Dreamcast. The Dreamcast then ends sales before Shenmue 2 is placed onto it. Then it's instead placed on Xbox. Not only is that a straight up hardware switch to follow the game, but players new to the series through Xbox would then be expected to also get a Dreamcast in order to experience the first chapter of the series. It wasn't very well thought out. And since this was the early 2000s, this was before you could watch a playthrough on YouTube, since that wasn't even around at the time. All the while, both Japan and Europe got both games on Dreamcast, making their experiences much more seamless. While that might sound like I'm trying to suggest Shenmue was a failure due to American sales being much lower from all the other hurdles, that's not what I'm trying to say here, though America might be a huge factor into that, as the market here is massive compared to smaller countries. Though, because of the lower sales leading to not making the money back in the games, that essentially put development on Shenmue 3 into development hell. The first time I had ever heard of Shenmue was through YouTube top 10 videos back in the day, but it was never truly on my radar and quickly forgotten. Fast forward to E3 2015, and that was changed when Shenmue 1 and 2 were both revealed to be getting HD updates, as well as Shenmue 3's Kickstarter being announced. Shenmue 3's Kickstarter was the biggest video game success at over $6 million raised. I was definitely curious to eventually see why so many people were into this series I knew next to nothing about. Now that I finally got my chance to take a look at the fabled Shenmue series with the first game, I can honestly say I'm hooked. Shenmue 1 is so very unique in how it does things. When you think of a video game, normally the first thing that comes to mind is gameplay rather than story. Shenmue not only has plenty of gameplay and story in it, but they both weave and flow with each other in a way that feels genuinely incredible. This isn't a game that's for everyone, but it's a game for the ones that see gaming as an art. Heck, I even bought a legit Dreamcast and a physical copy of Shenmue for it. There's a whole story about a retro gaming YouTube rabbit hole, but you probably get the idea. Now that I've introduced the game, how about we hop in and see what makes it tick? We're here to ask the all-important question on everyone's mind. What is a Shenmue? After only playing through the first game and not looking it up online, I have no idea what a Shenmue is. Is it a name of someone? A place? A thing? No idea. There's no information of that in the first game that I could find. Maybe in a future installment, perhaps. Anyway, I said Shenmue was very unique for what it brings to the table, and I meant that. There are quite a few things that you can do in the game. Experiencing an urban Japanese setting in the mid-1980s, opening drawers and picking up items, talking with every NPC you come across, playing older Sega games as mini-games, straight up gambling, combat, training, riding a bus, buying food. There is so much here that you can do. While that may sound like an overwhelming amount of things that you can do, this game has a slower pace to it. There's a day and night cycle in here, so you go through the days doing what you want to do. After waking up, you can leave your house and go play mini-games for the entire day before bed. Wake up the next day and do something else. It's up to you what you want to do each day. When I said it's a life sim, I meant it. Stuff you do in real life is pretty similar to stuff you can do in Shenmue, though without the need of bathrooms apparently. But let's say that a life sim isn't enough to interest you. There is a main story that you can follow as well. It's one of the bigger focuses to Shenmue that kept me intrigued and wanting to see what would happen next. The story was very interesting in my opinion, as it deals with the death of a father, a mystery with ancient artifacts, and revenge. You play as a young man named Ryo Hazuki, son to Iwao Hazuki. God, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. Owner of a martial arts dojo in 1986. It's the beginning of the game that sets the stage. Ryo arrives home to find the doors to the Hazuki residence open and a sign broken. There's an eerie atmosphere all around as he slowly makes his way through the yard. He talks with his caretaker Ine and friend Fukuhara after they're both hurt before entering the dojo proper. Ryo then arrives to see his father in a heated argument with a mysterious man sporting a uniquely designed dragon outfit, with two goons blocking him from entering. His father is then murdered right in front of him, while he was powerless to do anything to save him. The killer is named Lan Di, someone who was looking for some kind of artifact he called a mirror. Once he gets it, it doesn't look like a traditional mirror in any way, but apparently it's a mirror. Once Lan Di and his goons leave, there's a time skip of 4 days before we take the reins of Ryo's life. Ryo wants to find Lan Di at all costs and avenge his fallen father. This is all shown to the player in the span of a few minutes. It's the hook of the story, and a rather good one too. We're shown a few characters, how their personalities are in a dire situation, their relationships with each other, the main antagonist, and a mystery with an artifact. What is this dragon mirror? What does it do? How is it a mirror if it doesn't show a reflection? Oh, well, okay then. But now that we're into the story, what happens next is when the game opens up to you. You have virtually no leads to go off of, outside of the people and the black-colored car they were driving. So the way you would go to follow the story is going out and asking various people for information about what you know. Some will point you in the direction you should go until you arrive at an answer to the question you're on now. Then you'll get another thing to ask around about. Rinse and repeat. Sometimes you'll have cool story set pieces where cutscenes will start up and Ryo gets to be a straight-up badass. Ryo, having a martial arts background, is shown to be skilled enough at fighting that normal people can't do much against him. In a series of QuickTime events, yes, QuickTime events are in this game, as well as combat scenarios, Ryo eventually reaches the ending of the game, knowing he has to go somewhere else to continue his search for Lan Di. That might sound like a game that has no conclusion, but there's quite a bit that happens between the beginning of the game and the ending. Ryo ends up interacting with a ton of different people with many different backgrounds. Some are the average Joe Schmo, while others will have their fingers in the main plot of the series in some way. Ryo is a man with one thing on his mind, and that is vengeance. He will stop at nothing to get his revenge against Lan Di. Once you're given control of Ryo, you have 3 out of 5 zones available to you to traverse immediately. But likely the first thing you'll notice is how archaic the controls are at first. Ryo walks in a very stiff way. The camera is always directly behind him. Using the right analog stick will turn the camera in that direction, but it's all in whatever view Ryo himself can see in front of him as he turns his head as well. The reason for the movement and camera being this way is because when the game came out, it was a Dreamcast exclusive. The Dreamcast controller didn't have a second analog stick to turn the camera at all, so you would initially only see Ryo's back outside of cutscenes, combat, and animations like opening and closing doors. This is something I got used to over time. While the original Xbox did have 2 analog sticks, I'm going to assume that Shenmue 2 still has the same limitation due to the game being on Dreamcast in Japan and Europe, but I'll find out when I get around to playing that game. After you get used to how movement works, it's now that you find out exactly what you can do with Ryo, what kinds of things you can partake in doing, who you can talk to, and so on. You can even call the police immediately and get a response from Ryo.
No, I'll avenge my father's murder on my own.
Yes. You can use the phone in this game as well. You get a few different phone numbers you can call, and Ryo jots them down in his journal. We'll talk about the journal in just a bit. Remember the archaic design of how Ryo moved? You'll find that lack of fluid movement in a lot of different ways. That even translates to using the phone here. Since this is also part life sim, you have to move Ryo's hand left or right to choose the phone number you want to put in to call. This is something that just adds more to the immersion of the game's world, as well as the more retro feel of the game nowadays. Using the phone is just one of the many things you can interact with. Opening drawers, cabinets, picking up items, you name it. You'll see a lot of things like this done in the first-person view, basically Ryo's perspective. If something is of real importance to the main story, you might even get a quick cutscene where you'll see Ryo in third person. This is part of the detective-like aspects of the game coming into play. When Ryo picks up an item in first person, you'll be able to move it around a bit with his hand. Another funny thing to notice is how the sky moves as you turn Ryo in different directions. It's so out of place as it seems to move at a different speed and even a different direction to what you would think sometimes. Come on, guys. This is still when 3D gaming was new. This being a game that takes place in Japan, there are even small gacha machines that you can put money into to see what you get. Even this is shown to the player in first person for you to look at right before Ryo puts it back into his collection. And oh boy, is there a collection. So many different figures you can find throughout the game. Some even come from winning a drawing in the tomato store. Yes, the store is called Tomato, and the way to even draw is by going to one of the soda vending machines and hoping you find a winning can. Whether or not you find a winning can, Rio will gulp down the soda and either throw the can away properly or keep it to enter the drawing. Recycle, people. If you have the winning can, you can bring it to one of the convenience stores, find the can in your inventory, then draw the ticket. Most of the time, it seems you win nothing, but in the off chance you do win, it'll show you a number. Then you look at the paper associated with the prizes, look at the prizes you can pick from attached to the number you drew, and choose what you want. In all the sodas I've had Rio drink, I've only drawn a winner one time. And that's not to say you don't find winning cans often either, because these things drop for you fairly often. But this is an example of how some small things can be connected to each other. It may not seem like much, but it does flesh out the world a bit more. Look at it this way. You go to one of the many vending machines. If you get a winning can, you have to go to another location to potentially get your prize. If you win, you get the prize. If not, keep trying throughout the game and you might get something yet. There's actually 3 ways you get money in Shenmue. The first is Rio gets an allowance of 500 yen every day from Ine-san. The second is through gambling. I'm not sure if there's something people do to take advantage of this one, but it feels like gambling alright, because I lose every time. Finally, the third way to make money is through a full-time job Rio gets in the main story. That's right, a full-time job, but it's a bit more unique and woven into the story. We'll talk about this a bit later. When walking around the various zones, you'll see NPCs that are all walking around, working, chatting with each other, and so on. They're all set to their own schedules as well. One of the aspects of a life sim is to have a living and breathing world, and I can't stress the fact that this was a game from 1999 enough here, because I'm not sure there were many, if any, other games that were doing this stuff. Even if there were, this was in an era of gaming where 3D games were still new and experimental. Shenmue was quite revolutionary for its time. Going shopping for food, playing to win prizes in different contests, going to the arcade, the NPCs working jobs and then going home. This game had a lot going for it in terms of immersion. Heck, the buses even run on their own schedule, depending on if it's a weekday or weekend. A lot of things you have to spend your own in-game money on to partake in, of course. There's a lot this game has going for it. If you make a list of everything you can do, it might seem smaller than some games we get nowadays, but when you actually play the game, you really start to see how things start to click together. Just how much everything feeds into each other to really give you that life sim experience. You can even go see a fortune teller to get story hints, see the future, or...
Please tell me the gamble.
Yeah, some of the translations in this game aren't the greatest, but boy are they funny. Alright, let's get back to the NPCs. As you travel the world of Shenmue, you'll see them all doing their own thing. Most of the time when you interact with them, it will be Rio asking them a question pertaining to the next lead he's after. There are still characters that are more integral to the plot, or they actually talk about something else entirely. But one of the crazy parts is, most of the NPCs have unique lines for every batch of dialogue, and everything is voiced. In those early days of video game voice acting.
Hey, Hazuki, you think you can bump into me and not even apologize?
Yeah, jerk. Apologize to Enoki-san.
Well, maybe I'll just beat an apology out of you.
That includes all of the late 90s to early 2000s Japanese to English weird translations.
Years ago, I was Chinese.
The more you play the game, the more you'll talk to and pass by these characters, the more you'll come to know them and their lives, even where some of them live, as everyone has their family name written outside of their houses. The devs really wanted to simulate something close to actual life in this, which is, naturally, the idea of a life sim. But for this game being made back in the late 90s was wildly ambitious for the time. Dynamic weather effects weren't really part of the norm back in the late 90s, yet Shenmue has it. In Shenmue, time moves no matter what you're doing. Playing at the arcade, talking with someone, practicing combat, it doesn't matter. Time keeps moving no matter what. You'll see Rio's watch in the top right corner telling you precisely what time it is, so you can keep up with where you need to be or how much time you have left to do something. Even opening up the menu or reading through Rio's journal doesn't stop time at all. There is a way to pause the game, but that's not really immersive to the game, so yeah. And then, of course, you also have the characters who are involved with the main story, the ones who you are supposed to see at certain points of the story, not before, and sometimes not after. These characters can be the exception here, as you don't end up seeing their houses or their normal life routine. Some of these characters might be villains, so it would probably be weird if you could see them on the street randomly, wouldn't it? There are also some characters you might only see them working, and that's it. You won't find them wandering the streets of Dobuita or either of the housing areas closer to Rio's house. While the world of Shenmue is fairly big for the story it tries to tell, the areas aren't exactly the biggest in the world. 4 of the locations are connected through loading screen pathways, and the 5th is a bus ride. You're given the illusion that the world is bigger than what we can interact with. The 2 instances of this being the fact that you can use a bus to get to the harbor, as well as one quick section in the story where you ride a motorcycle to the harbor. That second one is a better example here. You end up riding to the harbor in the wee hours of the morning in a rush. As you ride, you'll notice you're passing by so many buildings on this trip. Not only that, but the distance you travel to get to the harbor is far bigger than any of the zones you can normally walk around in. This is showing us the world is bigger, even while we can't interact with it in any meaningful way. While this is a life sim, we still only touch a very small portion of it. And because there's only 5 zones to move around in, we're in them, moving back and forth very often. But that's not to say they're empty, or there's nothing to do in them. Heck, the sights may seem repetitive over time, but the amount of time you go walking through them, you come to know them like the back of your hand. Where all the shops are located, where certain NPCs will hang out, and so on. If someone tells you where you need to go for your next lead, you'll know by the end of the game the shortest route to get there. I'm sure there's people who've played Shenmue when they were kids and they say they grew up in these streets. That's not something every game or dev can claim. Look at the recent game Cyberpunk 2077. All the roads in that game were given street names so people could eventually learn Night City as if they lived there. But the city in that game is so large, and the offer of putting on waypoints causes people to not really learn where they are at a given time, outside of notable landmarks. Shenmue 1 doesn't have this problem. The slower pace and the time spent in it teaches the player all they need to know without ever giving them a waypoint to follow. It's context clues, and I think this game does it masterfully. It may seem tough to find out where you need to go at the beginning, but given a few more hours, you'll begin to learn a lot more. Alright, enough about that. Let's talk about what you can do in these locations. There's actually a lot you can do to pass the time in Shenmue, and trust me, you're going to be passing the time a lot in this game, since you can't skip forward in time outside of sleeping at night. Anyway, there are a lot of mini games you can partake in. Some of them are quite literally older Sega arcade games. In the location called Dobuita, there's literally a Sega arcade you can go into that has those games. You can play badly at darts.
No good.
Sega's Space Harrier game. A QuickTime event game. Sega's Hang On game. And a few others, though this one is always broken for some reason. Other things involve drinking soda at the vending machines, walking into buildings unannounced, gambling, and practicing your fighting moves in places like the parking lot in Dobuita, the park when nobody is there in Sakuragaoka, a warehouse in the harbor, and the Hazuki Dojo in Ryo's house. You can purchase things from stores like food to use on side quests like feeding the kitten in Yamanose, getting more music to use with your Sega brand music player, and apparently playing some games on a Sega Saturn. Holy hell, this game has a ton of other games in it. And I haven't even been able to win any Saturn games since I can only get 1 prize from the soda contest this entire time. But you know what? How does Ryo have a Sega Saturn in 1986? The Saturn didn't release in Japan until 1994. Heck, the Genesis didn't even release until 1988. Immersion ruined. Hashtag literally unplayable. Anyway, some of the reasons you would do these activities are mainly to have fun, enjoy the life sim, or just to pass time. There are times during the main quest when you'll need to wait for a certain time of the day, or even the next day before you can continue. Since you can't skip time outside of sleeping at night, you're forced to wait your time out until then. At least there's plenty of activities to keep you doing something so the time seems to go by faster. Time in the game works, I believe, for every 1 hour in-game is 4 minutes real time. I think I calculated it correctly, so don't quote me on that. So if I'm correct, that essentially means that you wake up at 8:30 every day and go to sleep around 11 p.m. or so. It seems to fluctuate sometimes and really depends on when you decide to go to your room, or have Ryo himself just fast travel because you were out too late. The earliest you can go to sleep is 8 p.m. and a maximum of 15-ish hours. So basically, 1 full day is around 44 minutes to an hour, somewhere around that time frame. It's very manageable, and you'll find the days passing by fairly quickly as you play. And outside of certain points in the story where you're forced into doing things at certain times, you're pretty much given full reign of Ryo's life in these zones after you unlock Dobuita and the harbor. You get those too after certain points in the story itself. So if you have the ability to travel to all of the zones in the game, you can pretty much do whatever you want in the bounds the game sets for you. Do you go to the arcade for like 5 days straight? Do you go to the parking lot to train Ryo's combat moves? It's up to you. Though, while I didn't hit it myself, I did find out there's apparently a time limit to complete the story, or you get the bad ending of a game. While the game starts on November 29th, 1986, you don't get the reigns of Rio for another 4 days. But at that point, you have months before the game gives you the bad ending. Apparently, April 14th, 1987 is the last day you can do anything. Once April 15th hits, you get the bad ending.
I'll never tell you where Ryo-san is! Ah!
Fukusan! Lanti!
Ryo-san, don't do it!
I heard there's another mirror.
What?
Give it to me now.
Not a chance.
If that's the way you want it, I'll just take it from you.
I will avenge my father's death.
So while 3.5 months might not seem like a lot of time, according to howlongtobeat.com, Shenmue is on average 19.5 hours. That's around 20 to 30 days if you just bum rush the main story. So you have plenty of time to just mess around and get to know the world in the game. Honestly, the extra time will probably be good to get Ryo's attacks stronger via practicing. I heard that the save does transfer over to the sequel Shenmue 2, so I'm looking to prep another save before I actually head into that game. And believe me, after playing this game and getting really invested in the story and characters, it's tough for me to resist putting the second game on right now while writing this script. While you can practice your moves in empty spaces, there's two things you'll have a problem learning. That would be the grapple moves, as well as dodging and blocking. While you can use the dodge button in practice, it's another beast entirely to use it in actual combat. The grappling is impossible to do without another opponent, so you need that in order to make those moves stronger. And let me tell you, a fighting game expert, I am not. The combat in Shenmue, from my understanding, is based on the old Virtua Fighter games by Sega, though a major difference I can see right off the bat is Virtua Fighter seems to limit movement mostly to facing toward your opponent, so moving toward, away from, and possibly dodging to the side a bit. Not sure, never played them. This is very different from Shenmue's area-based combat. In Shenmue, you can walk around the area. This is taking a fighting game system and essentially giving you the entire arena. My assumption for this is because you end up fighting groups of enemies most of the time, rather than just one opponent. Not to mention how the fights show up at many different locations that aren't 1v1 arenas. Fights can be a bit chaotic due to the amount of enemies you tend to come up against, but the enemies do seem to have a pattern. When you're being attacked by one opponent, the others tend to wait. It definitely made it easier than a typical gang just beating up on Ryo or something. Regardless, it can still be tough as you go from focusing on one enemy to having another one to your side or one behind you throwing hits out instead. The pacing is fairly fast as you don't really get too much downtime, but it kind of feels pretty good because of that. Ryo has punches, kicks, and grapple attacks he can do, as well as dodge and parry on top of that. There's a dedicated button for all 4 of those, and the different moves you can use do get pretty deep in terms of how to use them. If you look at your list of moves that you can use, you'll see some button press combinations you need to perform to use the attack, like this one, Thunder Kick. It says to press right, then left, then the kick button. Once you do that in the order it says, you perform the kick. When you learn your various moves, it can take a lot of practice to understand how to use them correctly. Even though I used them a lot while practicing in the parking lot, using it in combat was a whole different beast entirely. It's one thing to go from dedicating time to a few moves while by yourself, and another thing to actually put what I learned into practice in actual combat. It's likely since I'm not really great at fighting games that my brain would go 1,000 different directions, focusing on a lot when I didn't need to, and just forgetting key moves I wanted to use and when to use them. Though with enough combat and a challenge of fighting 70 people once you beat the game, I did end up getting a bit better. That's not to say there's not stuff that doesn't feel a bit janky to me in combat. Remember those button combinations you need to use moves? Well, even if it shows the right arrow, that actually means toward your opponent. The left arrow means away from your opponent. This is fine enough to understand the theory of, and easy enough to put into practice. But once you come up against groups of enemies, your button combinations do end up changing on a dime. Ryo can be focused on the enemy you want to attack, and just before you start hitting this incredible button combo, an enemy behind Ryo gets too close, and Ryo changes changes targets at the last second. It completely changes up what move you were trying to use. While it still tends to work out fine in the end, since you're still using an attack on someone, it did throw off my rhythm quite a few times. Of course, it doesn't help that I don't have any fighting game muscle memory either. Alright, punches and kicks work in very easy to understand ways. They do damage if you're close enough to connect, and you use combos on your controller to use different moves. But what about dodging and grappling? This is where some of the systems get a bit more complicated and flesh the game systems out a bit more. Dodging having its own dedicated button definitely helps to make sure you're using it whenever you want to. Push in a direction and hitting the dodge button will make Ryo do a bit of a dash in that direction. Dodging backward and toward your opponent to get closer faster are understandable, but dodging to the side of opponents' attacks always had them tracking me anyway. It didn't seem to matter what I would do with that. Their attacks would always land. If any times it worked out, it was just sheer luck. That aside, if you don't push a direction, Ryo will duck a bit. This is what you will see happen when you're just practicing with no opponents. However, one thing I do understand pretty well is the parrying. So, depending on how far away your opponent is from Ryo will determine what Ryo does with the dodge button. As long as you don't push a direction, Ryo will either completely duck under the attack or slap their attack away in a parrying way. Both of these are dependent on how far away the opponent is. If they're close to Ryo, he'll parry. If farther away, Ryo will tend to duck under the attack. Either way, Ryo takes no damage from that, and then you can either immediately counterattack or use one of your moves. It's not the easiest thing in the world, as you still have to predict when your opponent is going to attack, but the timing for dodging and parrying is pretty forgiving. Not only does pulling off either make me feel pretty good at the game, but when you see the various counterattacks Ryo can pull off, it's just badass. Alright, let's talk about grappling in the game. Grappling, another technique with a dedicated button set for it, will have Ryo grabbing the opponent to throw them in some way. There are grappling moves that do require button combos to use, as well as grapples that are based on where Ryo is around the enemy, like the sides or behind. The various grapples look really cool, but enemies can break out of them as well. Enemies will also use grapples on Ryo as well. You can break out of grapples if you hit the grapple button fast enough in the animation. Trying to juggle between parrying and breaking out of a grapple is pretty tough, but good thing the buttons are so close to each other. Everything is so kung fu, and then you see Ryo literally pile drive someone's head into the pavement. That's gonna require some stitches. So while I said before that you really can't practice dodging and grappling by yourself, you're forced to grow them in combat. That can be a pretty tall order since fights happen at predetermined parts of the game. There is one way you can get a consistent training partner though. Once you get to a certain part in the story, Fuku-san will offer to spar with Ryo. After that, you can spar with him once a day. This will help you to really get better at fighting before coming across some of the tougher opponents. Not only that, but it's the perfect time to learn how to dodge and parry, as well as get better with grappling. Your grappling attacks can only get stronger from using them on opponents after all. However, after you get so far into the story, you won't be able to spar with Fuku-san anymore, so take full advantage of that time while you can, especially since the strength of your moves transfers over to the sequel. As for Ryo's wide variety of attacks, he starts out with quite a lot of them, the story being he was taught by his father. Even with that, Ryo can learn many more moves to use throughout the game. There are scrolls that can teach him, as well as a lot of people that can show him new moves he can use, though sometimes they don't exactly explain it that well. Outside of combat, there are times where the game will have Ryo fighting others or chasing down someone, and it turns into a QuickTime event. According to some places online, people are saying that Shenmue was one of the first games to actually do this mechanic. Apparently, even the creator Yu Suzuki himself coined the term QuickTime event. Regardless, these QuickTime events, or QTEs, are brutal with the amount of time they give the player to press what's necessary. Not only that, but sometimes they come out of nowhere when you least expect them. Though thankfully, while they can be tough to do, not all of them will end up in a failure should you miss one or two. Some of them have a longer sequence they go through, so because of that, there is some buffer room for misses. Though that isn't all the time. The other times where failure will set you back, thankfully, it's never too far. You pretty much get sent back to just before the whole QTE starts. By that point, you're prepared. Just be accurate with your button presses when you need to press them, and you'll be golden. Overall, the combat is fun, hectic, and has quite a bit of depth that I can see plenty of players try to cheese after a while. When the combat gives players the ability to make quick decisions and sharp movement, you get what Shenmue has. A combat system that takes some getting used to, but has a high skill ceiling. From the sheer amount of ways you can use the dodge to move away from and to your opponent is very fun when combined with punishing combos. Watching someone perfect the way they can fight on YouTube is some of the coolest content I've seen recently. Remember when I said Ryo can get a full-time job? Yeah, it's involved with using a forklift. His job is to move boxes from one location to another, but before you can start your shift, there's a warm-up phase where you race the other drivers. This is very dangerous. Would not recommend in real life, but since this is a video game, I'm sure it's alright. This job is part of the main story, and you'll get cutscenes at random intervals. But at the same time, Ryo gets paid for every box he moves, so moving as many boxes as possible is definitely a good way to get some easy money. When I first got to experience combat in the game, I was really bad at it. I expected that going in since I don't play fighting games, but I did intend to not only see the game through to the end, but also to get better at fighting. It was definitely one heck of an experience to learn. It wasn't that easy to really start understanding how the combat worked since the fights are all set to specific spots in the story. And some of them are completely missable too. Thankfully, I had Fuku-san to help me learn from there and really understand how to play. Frustrating at first, always challenging, but once you understand what you're doing, it's very fun. With that out of the way, let's switch to the story for a bit. Now, I'm a firm believer that a great video game story should be experienced rather than told, so I'm going to go into some details here and there, but not give too much context. I highly recommend anyone that's interested in a game like this to go out and play it themselves. If you don't have a Dreamcast, it's also available on Steam for PC, PS4, and Xbox One. The console versions should be playable on current Gen 2, but I can't test that myself. Anyway, let's talk story. I told you all before how the game started out. A cutscene with Ryo seeing his father killed right before his eyes, and now he's on the hunt for the man who did the deed. A stone-cold killer with a gaze so cold it scares people. The man called Lan Di. With that intro having done some really good job setting up the characters, their motivations, and really turning the oven on to that cold start, things really do change drastically for story pacing. When you see the intro, everything is moving forward in a fast and mysterious way. We get to see some of the characters in a dire situation, as well as just how big of an obstacle Lan Di is for Ryo to overcome in the future. Lan Di leaves after getting an ancient Chinese mirror that we know nothing about. This intro has everything going for it, but everything after that is done in a very different way. This is where some players might actually end up getting turned off from the game. It's not story beat after story beat like that intro for most of the game. This is where the life sim starts to really show itself. Don't get me wrong, the story is still very prevalent in what Ryo does, but the player has the freedom to do what they want now. Go do all of those life sim things you're curious about. You have the time for it. Where progressing the main story is concerned, whenever Ryo talks to people, he'll ask them questions based on whatever lead he has at the time. That is, until he gets to the next question to ask about. For example, at the start of the game, we're shown a black car outside of the dojo. That's one of the first leads that Ryo asks about until he hears that Lan Di may be Chinese. Then Ryo will ask around for information on that. The mystery goes deeper and deeper the further you go. In doing so, Ryo will sometimes find himself face to face with people who want to harm him. Ryo, being the kung fu badass he is, finds little trouble taking them all down as he goes about his mission. When asking people for information, you might come across a few different ways to progress the story. There are NPCs that don't know the answers to the questions Ryo will ask. There are also ones who have an inkling where Ryo might find that information, and even others that can point Ryo in the direction he needs to look. Obviously, there are characters that do know the information, but finding out who they are is part of the game. There are cutscenes and side quests that are completely missable in Shenmue. Some you'll miss because you didn't show up to a certain place, others that you forgot about continuing, and even ones that require very specific conditions to be met to even have a chance of having them pop up. Apparently, there's some side quests that require certain weather by a certain point of the story, as well as a location you happen to be walking by in order to trigger them. You get really lucky when you come across some of these, as not everyone sees these, let alone know they exist. It's interesting and actually makes different playthroughs unique from each other. At the same time, it can really hurt a completionist run. After having beaten the game once now, I started up a second playthrough to see some of the things I might have missed. I then found out just how quick it really is to go through the main story when you know where to look. This is a shorter game, only taking me about 19 hours to get through. I really sped through the beginning portion of the story without really meaning to, but after experiencing it and knowing some of the stuff I do carries over to the sequel, I wanted to run through again. There's a lot that the player can miss in Shenmue, from small things like items and drawers to larger things like cutscenes and some fights. I would call this a trial and error game. It's one that takes multiple playthroughs to really appreciate, not to mention the slower pace it presents to the player. While the story isn't wall-to-wall cutscenes in action, it's still very well done. It's just a different type of storytelling. Obviously, since this is only the first game in the series, it doesn't end with the main antagonist being beaten. There's more to this world, the characters, the mystery, and just overall experience. Not to mention the world of Shenmue itself is probably one of the biggest characters in the game. Now, while the game does take that slower approach to its storytelling, that doesn't mean things don't speed up. As you get closer to the end of the game, the action sequences really start to build up much more than before. Where the beginning of the game was barren of combat, and the middle had splashes of it here and there, the ending is where everything you've learned really comes to the forefront. All of the moves you've learned, how to fight, the knowledge Ryo knows, it's all there. And Ryo really gets to show off just how capable of a person he is when it comes to fighting and being a detective. While Ryo is confident in his battle prowess, he's still young and prone to outbursts, as well as losing in fights against people more experienced than he is. This is a tale of revenge, growth, and mystery. There's a lot that happens in this first entry, but we're still left with so many questions unanswered by the end, something I'm sure the sequels will help to answer. Just need to get to them first. Outside of that, as you go through the game, Ryo will write things down in his journal. You can go back and read what he's written down at any time. He'll write down phone numbers, clues, questions he might have, and so on. It's very useful overall, though something I did notice is that everything he writes seems to have a very specific spot dedicated to it. It's something that may break your immersion, because now there's a random blank spot there. But there's also something good that comes out of this. With each blank space, you know you missed something in the game. That can help you with knowing when to look around during other playthroughs if you go that route. And a lot of this can tie into side quests, conversations with people, some clues the others give you, and the like. But as far as the story goes, I think it's really well done. It's not very traditional in how it goes about it, but it was enjoyable just vibing in this 1980s Japanese setting along the way. The game had this weird way of just going from walking around town and going to an arcade to raising the tensions with some random thugs trying to attack Ryo. And all of this just works together somehow that gives the game a bunch of vibes while raising the stakes. Ryo is after Lan Di. He's hell-bent on finding him and making him pay. It's an interesting hook to the story that's always just around the corner while you're drinking a soda or something.
Ah, good.
Always in the back of your head, and eventually you find your way there in a short jaunt of about 19 hours or so. With that said, that's probably far enough with talking about the narrative of the game. Don't want to go too far and spoil some major things. Seriously, if you're interested in a vibes game, try Shenmue. You won't regret it. A short little thing I'd like to talk about is the music. Sega has always done amazing with music in their games, and Shenmue's soundtrack is no different. From atmospheric songs to that of combat music, the game has something that fits the setting just right. Ryo's Home Dojo has a song that sounds more like a traditional Japanese song. Take a listen. And something I couldn't stop listening to was the music that plays during combat. It doesn't vary greatly from where it starts, but it definitely helps to make me want to fight. I enjoyed the soundtrack a lot, pretty much to the point I ended up listening to all of it on YouTube while writing this script. I don't have a problem, I swear. There were a bunch of songs I don't recall hearing in the game, so I'm kind of convinced that those might be in Shenmue 2. Regardless, I did enjoy it enough to keep listening to it. After all, what better way to have a game as widely varied in content as Shenmue than to give it a soundtrack that fills in for every situation? Honestly, grade A stuff. I've heard that Shenmue is supposed to be around 5 or so games total. We only have 3 games as of the making of this video. I have yet to experience Shenmue 2 or 3, so all of what I've experienced is purely based on the first game. I don't know what to expect with the second, and I've heard some questionable things about the third game, but things seem to be going in an upward trend for Shenmue recently. A company called Inen Games recently attained the publishing rights to Shenmue 3 and is talking about a future for that game. While it's likely talking about more ports, I'm also wondering if it means some game and feature updates as well. After experiencing the combat in the first game and just how exact and visceral it really is, I would really like that same feeling for the rest of the series, but we'll find out in due time. With Shenmue being called a very ambitious and influential game for its time, that means there's a lot that the game had going for it that games many years later are still using today. Now, I don't want to presume here, but games like the Like a Dragon series seem to take influence from Shenmue. Stuff like the open world, inspecting items, using certain objects, playing full-on Sega arcade games, the list goes on. Sure, some of these things Shenmue probably didn't create first, but it's the fact that the game has them that people looked at. It's a game that introduced a lot of different systems to players and other developers. Remember when I said that Shenmue was apparently the most expensive game ever made at that time? Well, some of that budget went into the graphics, the audio, and how the characters look. While it's obviously nothing compared to today's games, this was still in the experimental 3D gaming era. The detail on some of the characters' faces was really well done for its time. You can even see the veins in Ryo's hands. That's a level of detail you didn't really see back during that console generation. To say this 25-year-old game made an impression on me would be accurate. I very much enjoyed my time in Shenmue 1. Experiencing the world, the combat, the characters, the story, and every little nugget of detail they put into this game. It was one hell of an experience. The slower pace of the story, to just walking around places like Sakuragaoka or Dobuita. The experience I got from this game was just what I was looking for. If you look at all of the games you've played from last generation and this current one, a lot of them try to be blockbusters in every way they can. Now that's not a bad thing, but it does take away from a lot of the old experimental type of gaming we used to have. The PS1, N64, and Sega Saturn console generation, otherwise known as Generation 5, is when video game experimentation got into the 3D realm. While we've had incredibly layered stories in the older 16-bit era, namely Final Fantasy VI, once the third dimension opened up to developers, the potential to make absolute masterpieces in gaming as an art form suddenly appeared in front of us. Shenmue is a great example of this experimental period in gaming, and while the story of Shenmue isn't quite finished, it does still seem to have a potential future ahead that we can experience. Where the games go from here is anyone's guess now, but I'm a fan now, and very eager to hop into the sequels. It's still funny how Ryo's jacket is pretty blurry on some of the patches, whereas Lan Di, a character that's barely in Shenmue 1, his outfit is immaculate. Now, for the final question. What is a Shenmue? The world may never know. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you liked the video. I'm not gonna lie when I say that I had a list of games I wanted to play and make video essays on before this. They were in a great order, and then I ended up falling into a YouTube rabbit hole that increased my love for retro gaming a ton. While I had heard of Shenmue before I tried it out, it wasn't until my slow descent into retro gaming madness that I really looked into this series. And yeah, I loved it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a second playthrough to go through before hopping into Shenmue 2 at an undisclosed time in the future. Adios.